Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Exposure. We got a special guest today. I'm super excited about this. If you haven't already, subscribe, the YouTube thing, the algorithm thing. But today we are joined by Erick Kaardal, and I'm jacked about this because yesterday over on Neil Johnson's channel, I was able to get Janel Brandtjen on from Wisconsin 22 talking about everything going on with Mark Zuckerberg, the CTCL, everything going from soup to nuts on that. Well, Erick is highly involved in that, and we're going to get into his involvement in a second. But Erick, thank you for joining us, man. We really appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks, Marcus. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So I want to go back to kind of the beginning. Give us a synopsis of who you are, for those who don't know, and how you got to where you are right now with the Thomas More Society.
Well, I think I'm a lawyer in Minnesota. I started in Redwood Falls, Minnesota, small town. Parlayed a ROTC scholarship to go to Harvard undergrad, University of Chicago Law School. Spent 10 years in the reserves, got out as a captain. And it's been pretty good. With respect to law, I discovered that early on that because I grew up in a small town, that large law firms didn't make a lot of sense to me. I didn't relate. So I ended up at a small law firm after a couple of years at a large law firm in Minneapolis. And then a small law firm, I discovered, I do like, arguing with judges over laws. It seemed to me that was a place where I could help. Then I kind of discovered that if you want to argue with judges over laws, you got to be kind of involved in cases where the governments are a party. And I respect criminal defense lawyers, but I noticed that in civil cases, generally, it was unfair in the sense of the citizen or business would have a lawyer who only takes a case, maybe once every 5 years against the government, whereas the government had above average lawyers. I mean that in a good way. And so then I said, maybe I could help businesses and citizens suing the government. And then I looked at it and I said, well, maybe I could offer my services in every subject area. And then everyone, when I said that, Erick's going to sue the government in every subject area. That's impossible. You're a maverick. That's stupid, whatever. But then 25 years later, the local newspapers and everyone recognizes that I've made a career out of suing the government. Now, in the very first instance, one might ask, well, what does that prove? Well, it really proves because I've won a lot. I've won dozens and dozens of cases. On my website, I have 42 examples of cases I've won against the government. Those are cases to judgment. Wow. What it proves is that our government's out of control. Yeah. And it's in every subject area. The government is out of control. So, for example, when I give a talk, to a group of people or something, I usually start this way. Look, you're an ordinary person. I'm an ordinary person. We know how to read. The public officials, they know how to read too when it comes to reading statutes and legal provisions that authorize their power. But when it comes to limiting their power, not so much. So the government does not want to follow laws which restrict the government's power. That's why they've gotten into everything. They're into everything now. It used to be just in the bedroom. Now it's like in the bathroom, in the kitchen, in the living room, in the dining room, in the pantry. You name it, the government's in it. That's because the government doesn't follow restrictions on the power. Now, restrictions could be in the U.S. Constitution, could be in the state constitutions, could be in federal law, state law. They're all over the place. But because of what I discovered this, then I was able to sue every type of government and win. So I've sued every type of government and won. I've sued federal agencies, state agencies, counties, cities, townships, school districts, public universities, drainage authorities, watershed districts. They go on and on. All this government, they're all exceeding the powers that are in the law. And so people contact me and I sue them.
So government overreach sounds like it's good for business.
Yeah, it has been, but it's a sad commentary.
Yeah, it's true.
On government that our public officials can't read. How disappointing, right? And particularly ours are so credentialed in Minnesota they get all these degrees. They even have master's degrees. They have the Hubert H. Humphrey Public Institute. They go there, but then when it comes to legal provisions that limit their powers, they don't read. They can't read. And it's just so crazy.
Yeah.
And
so how did you get connected up with the Thomas More Society? And explain for those who don't know what the Thomas More Society is.
Yeah, the Thomas More Society is a national public interest law firm. And it's really a cool organization because they started off by aligning themselves with sidewalk counselors outside abortion clinics. And they basically, Tom Brecko is representing Joe Scheidler, who's the godfather of the pro-life movement. And National Organization for Women and Planned Parenthood basically aligned to put pro-life protesters out of business by calling them a racketeering enterprise under RICO, and also saying it was antitrust violations. And Brecka, who's still alive and still running the organization, he fought them every step of the way. In a 28-year battle, 3 trips to the U.S. Supreme Court, they won.
Wow.
And the law firm kind of emerged from that. But the law firm then, Thomas More Society out of Chicago, they ended up becoming an organization that really understood how the left operated. And they developed lots of techniques and litigation strategies, but never forgetting that their principal role was to defend sidewalk counselors and like people. And now they're doing the Daleiden defense. Daleiden was the one that did the undercover videos regarding Planned Parenthood selling aborted baby parts. Oh. And they're doing his defense because Planned Parenthood strikes again and said the undercover videos were illegal and tortious and criminal. And so they're battling to defend people who are battling the government to improve it. And so that's close to my heart. A lot of my cases involve, some sort of retaliation or retribution by the government, some sort of vengeance the government imposes on the people.
Yeah.
And so Thomas More Society has always had been a kindred spirit in that regard.
How is it affiliated with the Amistad Project and Phil Klein?
Yeah, Phil Klein is a Liberty University law professor, and he was a long-term client of the Thomas More Society and then ended up being a collaborator. He was a client because in Kansas, he was sort of on the front lines with respect to the pro-life battle. And Thomas More Society came to his aid in that. That's probably for another show. But then he ended up moving to Liberty University. He was a former Kansas Attorney General, and he ended up planting his roots there. And then he came up with this Amistad Project idea, and Thomas More Society and Phil Klein collaborated. So Phil Klein is the director of the Amistad Project, and Thomas More Society is the sponsor.
And so you got connected up with the Thomas More Society, and now you're into Wisconsin. And I want to kind of give people the lay of the land of what you're doing in Wisconsin. Give people kind of a run up to how you got into it, or what you're doing in Wisconsin and where it sits at right now.
Right. So when I came to the Thomas More Society Amistad Project, I had 15, 20 years of experience in election integrity lawsuits, particularly working with Minnesota Voters Alliance, Andy Selick. And so I was offered this opportunity to work with the Thomas More Society Amistad Project. And so I took it. And the big theory that we came up with in August and September of 2020 was that that Zuckerberg was giving $350-400 million to the Center for Tech and Civic Life for the purpose of having private corporations engage in election administration. So it's a classic pay-to-play scheme. You throw this money at the urban election officials, and then the urban election officials will allow allied private corporations to engage in election administration in these urban areas. And so, what would be the motive of Mr. Zuckerberg and his wife to give all that money, as well as the other big tech gazillionaires? And the motive was they wanted to affect the election outcome. They weren't going to spread the money, amongst all the states, because only the swing states matter in the presidential election. And then with respect to the swing states, they were just going to give money to urban election departments because that's where they knew they could make a difference.
Right.
And so rather than spending the money campaigning, which is traditionally done, in 2020 was the first time we ever saw the oligarchs invest in election administration. I mean, what kind of country is this? I mean, this sounds like we're some sort of third world country, the tin pot dictator.
So then my question for you in that regard is, how is that lawful that they're allowed to take in private corporation money? I mean, granted, it's through a nonprofit of the CTCL, but what law states that they're allowed to take that money and distribute it all over the country for election integrity?
Oh, right. It's electioneering, and it's prohibited. The U.S. Constitution says that the ones that run the elections, right, who determine how the elections are run, are the state legislatures. In Article 1, it says the state legislatures set the time, place, and manner of the congressional elections. In Article 2, it says the state legislatures choose the manner of appointment of the presidential electors. And then in most states, like in Wisconsin, then it says, in Wisconsin, it says the Wisconsin Election Commission. In other states, it says the Secretary of State has general authority to administer the elections. And then the local clerks have charge and supervision of the election. If you let the private activists, the corporations come in, you're displacing the elected officials or the appointed officials who are supposed to run the election.
Is Mark Zuckerberg able to be held accountable for the money that he was given to the CTCL?
Yeah, I think ultimately, I mean, the challenge is, we're just starting the investigation. And so as we're getting documents, we're filing lawsuits. Like in Wisconsin, we got the documents in Green Bay. The Green Bay clerk, who was an election integrity hero, he's probably the reason why I'm here talking to you today, is because she was the one that identified it. But Sandy Juneau, she was election clerk in Green Bay. She said, well, receiving the private money, that's legally unauthorized. Private corporate conditions, when you receive the money, that's legally unauthorized. Private corporations engaging in election administration, that's legally unauthorized.
So then I gotta stop you right here, because why are these people not being held accountable then?
Well, that's the beautiful thing about Wisconsin, is they have what's called a private cause of action to sue their election officials. So one of the challenges when you're suing state and local officials is that each state has sovereign immunity from lawsuit. So the state legislature has to waive the sovereign immunity. Now, we're kind of familiar with this. Oh, you can sue the government for a tort, but that's because of the Tort Claims Act. You can sue the government for documents that you've requested. That's because of the Data Practices Act. You can sue the government for environmental violations. That's the Environmental Rights Act. Well, in Wisconsin, they actually have an act where voters can sue their election officials for violating state or federal law. And this is a beautiful law. It's just fantastic for a lawyer like me, right? Yeah. And but one of the restrictions is you have to sue your own election officials. You can't, be a voter in Green Bay and sue the election officials in Racine, even if they're doing the same thing. So that's why we're in this situation where we have to file separate lawsuits. First in Green Bay 2 weeks ago. A week ago, we filed a lawsuit in Racine. And this week, earlier, we filed on Monday the lawsuit against Kenosha. And then we're preparing lawsuits against Milwaukee and Madison. So the point is that there are 5 cities that early on, before even Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Detroit and Atlanta and Phoenix got their money, Wisconsin was the first state. And the CTCL went up to Wisconsin and recruited these 5 liberal mayors of liberal cities to engage in the grant application process. But it wasn't an ordinary grant application process, because CTCL was recruiting the people to apply for the grants. They were kind of creating the system as they went along. They wanted to make it as normal as possible. They were kind of dressing up, what you might call the bribe, right? The pay-to-play scheme. So they wanted to make it look like a COVID grant, but it wasn't a COVID grant. What kind of a COVID grant has a goal of electing liberal candidates to statewide national office? Right. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, if you care about people, you care about people, not only the cities, you care about everybody.
have you, and I don't want to get into like the logistics of what you guys are doing with the lawsuits, because I don't want to give away your argument or anything. But as much as you can tell us, have you had any evidence of the paper trail of where this money has been going?
Oh, sure. This is the beautiful thing about my legal practice is I'm focused on violations of the law that are above the table. I mean, if I look below the table, oh my God! I mean, there'd be many lifetimes of work. So I'm just interested in the official sort of bribery.
So everything's on the record then,
right? So here,
good.
The $7 million, or $6 or $7 million, was offered to the Wisconsin 5 cities with a condition that said, if you don't follow our directions, we get all the money back. So Marcus, and so we're dealing with Chicago-based organizations here. They know what they're doing. So you can't just put in the document, look, we'll give you $6.5 million. You engage our private corporations in election administration, because that's a bribe, right? So what they do is they give the money to the cities first. They say, we're going to take the money back if you don't engage our private corporations in election administration. But it's the same thing, but it's meant to fool ordinary people to think, oh, this is just a typical contract. This happens every day. The private corporations come in and they run the election for the city. And it's just what happens. It's not like building a road. I mean, when you have a road, you contract with the city, you build a road, you have subcontractors. When you run an election, the reason why the U.S. Constitution and state law require public officials administer the election is because they're supposed to be impartial and fair, and they take oaths to do so. And so with respect to these private corporations, we don't even know how to deal with that. So when Mr. Spitzer Rubenstein from National Vote at Home Institute was in Green Bay running the election, he actually had control of the central count facility. He was had control of the absentee ballot processes, where the absentee ballot boxes would go, the truck delivery routes, the delivery. They were buying trucks to transport these voting navigators, which we can talk about. You don't. I mean, what do you do? I mean, the laws are set up that you sue public officials for violating election duties. Can you sue a private corporate official for violating a public official duty? Probably not.
So you're saying that he had control of the shipment of where these trucks were going, and what else did he have control of?
Well, one thing he had the keys to the central count facility.
Yeah.
So he was the one that secured the room for the central count facility. In the central count facility, he had his own desk and computer, and he was monitoring everything. This is all just part of the record. Then they introduced in these cities voting navigators. The voting navigators were people who went out and helped people fill out their absentee ballot application envelopes and ballots. Yeah. But the reason why they did that was because Wisconsin, as all other states, prohibits absentee ballot harvesting. You can't go into a nursing home, like collect 100 ballots and bring them in. But they wanted that. So what they did was they have the voting navigators be privately financed, privately directed, but nominally public employees. You wouldn't know they're public employees other than someone saying, well, you can't do that. That's absentee ballot harvesting. Well, no, they're voting navigators. They work for the city. And so the voting navigator was a brainchild of the National Vote at Home Institute. But you even think of the name of the National Vote at Home Institute, it's meant to juxtapose against absentee ballot harvesting. Well, absentee ballot harvesting, right. Evil. Vote at home, good. And it's like, really? You guys your best and brightest are spending all your time to circumvent state laws so you can win elections illegally. I mean, it's just horrific. And I'll be one more. Center for Civic Design, which is one of these allied private corporations, they had, for the Wisconsin 5 cities, they completely redesigned the absentee ballot application, envelope, and ballots, and they were printing them. And now there is an email saying that the Wisconsin Election Commission, which is basically like a Secretary of State's office, Wisconsin Election Commission was saying, well, no, we want to use a uniform ballot. We want to use a uniform instruction. So I don't know if they actually used them in the Wisconsin 5. But the point is the chutzpah of private corporations coming in and saying, we're going to redesign the ballot. We're going to redesign the instructions, the envelope. We'll be the ones to guide the delivery of these documents. We'll have these voting navigators. I mean, they basically thought through the whole process and they wanted the private corporations to run it.
I've got this theory, Eric, that I've been mulling around, and it's not just focused around Wisconsin, but the whole nation. And the theory is that it doesn't matter the amount of fraud that they had going on. They wanted as much as possible in as many places as possible. Just basically, instead of painting this fine picture, they basically took a gallon of paint and said, we're going to throw this against a blank canvas, and whatever sticks. Basically, we'll act first and ask for forgiveness later rather than for permission. And in this case, it seems like Wisconsin, even though it's somewhat below the radar, because right now Maricopa is going crazy. There's stuff going on over in Antrim County with the lawsuit there. And other places around the country are starting to percolate. Wisconsin seems to be kind of getting more and more under the radar. And we talked to Janel yesterday, and she had mentioned that there's quite a few people that just feel this sentiment of, let's just move on. We have to move on. And for whatever reason, I asked her, whether it was fear-based or not, but she gave a few answers, and you guys can go watch that interview over on my channel. But to see this in Wisconsin, to be so well orchestrated, basically what you're describing is they had total control from soup to nuts. And Chris Teskey, who you said is an American hero, and I truly believe that. I would love to have her on sometime, because I would love to say, thank you, Patriot, for doing what you did. And B, let's stand together in courage. But they had total control, and the mayor of Green Bay was basically coercing her to do what Michael Spitzer Rubenstein wanted her to do. And she said, I can't take this anymore, and I'm out.
No, that's exactly correct. So you had a clerk there, basically pushed out of her responsibilities so that the private corporations could run the election. And then as a witness to that, the recently retired Brown County clerk, Sandy Juneau, has testified to the same. And she's been going with me to the press conferences. We had one in Green Bay, one in Racine, and one in Kenosha. And Sandy Juneau does a nice job of saying, this is how prior to 2020 elections worked. The clerk was in charge. The clerk took an oath to be fair and impartial. The clerk administered the election. This is what happened in 2022 due to the 2020 due to the federal elections being influenced by private corporations. Yeah. The private corporations engaged in election administration and ran the election. And there's very little. There was one comment in the Kenosha press conference by Sandy Juneau, I think in response to a question, and that was, well, what did you see? And she said, well, I saw Mr. Spitzer Rubenstein, the Vote at Home Institute employee, at the central count facility, and he had a desk and a computer, and he was administering the election. And then Sandy Juneau asked, who is he? Who does he work for? And she never really got a clear action whether she was working for the city or for Vote at Home Institute. But the records will show that he was not a city employee. And so he identified himself as National Vote at Home Institute. Now, the Wisconsin Election Commission was aware of Mr. Spitzer Rubenstein and his role. And the Wisconsin Election Commission would probably say, well, they were consultants. But with the money, you see, they weren't consultants. It was pay to play. Yeah. And so the $7 million went in. In Green Bay, that's like more than $20 per voter. I mean, who would pay, $6 or $7 million to access to the ballot box without wanting to affect the ballot box? And again, our complaint here is that, they didn't work through proper channels. They could have gone to the state legislature. They could have donated the money. It would have been spread statewide. But their focus was on urban election ballot boxes. And they wanted to get people to vote so they could influence the statewide national election.
Well, because those 5 cities are the 5 biggest cities in a small state, that where the rural areas don't have as much population as the major cities do, Madison, Milwaukee, Kenosha, Racine, and Green Bay. All you need are those basically swing counties or swing cities within the swing state. But if there are these red flags, Eric, that were popping up, and this is a question that I don't feel got addressed fully yesterday with Janel's interview. If there were these red flags that were popping up all over the place pre-November 3rd or even on November 3rd or post-November 3rd, why wasn't there more uproar about this? Why weren't more questions being asked about these red flags?
Well, it's more like, I think that the red flags went up. Amistad Project, I think, was a voice in the wilderness saying, look, this money is being used to unduly influence election administration. And so we went at it. But I think that the real problem was that this was so clever that these leftist private corporations did it this way that they knew they wouldn't be caught in the traditional post-election contest process.
Yeah.
So after an election, there's a brief period of time when candidates can challenge the election results. But such a brief period of time, and the limitations are so severe. For example, in Wisconsin, you're limited to a recount. You couldn't bring up election administrative issues.
Okay.
But the way the media spun it was that all these lawsuits and everything failed, so we had a perfect election.
Yeah. And
now anyone who's criticizing election administration, the 2020 election, from their point of view, is insane. But look, I'm telling you, I'm a witness. I've done over 200 appeals involving the government. I've won dozens and dozens and dozens of lawsuits against the government, different types of governments. I've got 42 examples on my website. I'm telling you that in Wisconsin, that there's undue influence by these private corporations on election administration. If we prove that in Wisconsin, understanding the methodology that Center for Tech and Civic Life used, we can then know that we can prove it in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona.
Yeah,
and of course, in Minnesota too, because Minneapolis received $3 million.
Yeah,
and actually, Grace Walkerwitz, the former city clerk for Minneapolis, was on the board of advisors for Center for Tech and Civic Life. So I think Minneapolis is probably one of the prototype cities where they've been testing out some of this stuff. A lot of people have noticed the surge in voting in Minneapolis, particularly the congressional district there in Minneapolis precincts. And the reason is that I believe that, well, do I need to prove it? I mean, if it happens in Green Bay and Milwaukee and Kenosha and Minneapolis received the money, the same thing's happening there. It's the same private corporations engaging in election administration.
Yeah.
It's just that we didn't know the methodology used in all these cities until Chris Teskey objected and created an email trail of all of her objections and them overrunning her.
I want to get back to what you were talking about going to Michigan and Pennsylvania and Georgia in just a second, but have you been in contact with Chris Teskey at all?
No, I just have talked to people who've talked to Chris Teskey. She was basically forced out of her job there. She filed a hostile work environment claim. Yeah. And then she picked up a clerk's job at a suburb. Yeah. And so she doesn't want to lose her current job. So she fears retaliation. It's so bad now. It used to be, I was just joking with a colleague, in the old days, you file a First Amendment lawsuit and the plaintiffs would have a press conference like I've done in these cities, right? Yeah. And you'd have a press conference, you announce what you've done. Now it's like when the conservatives file a First Amendment lawsuit, the other side has a press conference denouncing the filing of the First Amendment lawsuit. It's a completely different world. I mean, it used to be we all support each other First Amendment rights. Yeah. That now the left doesn't support that.
And that's another philosophical conversation that we could have for another day, controlling the narrative, the media spin. I mean, it's run amok, and that's what has been exposed this last 4.5 years. So going back to what you had mentioned, if you can do this in Wisconsin, it could kind of filter out around the country. I think that the ultimate question that comes from that, Erick, is, and this is out of frustration from a lot of people that I've heard from, and that is, so what? So what if it filters out into Michigan and Georgia and Pennsylvania and potentially Nevada and Arizona? Nothing happens. Nothing seems to happen from all this. We get into these court situations. We get into these litigation battles. We fight it all the way to the Supreme Court. It's either accepted, it's thrown out based on standing. There's no appeals process, and then people just move on with their lives. And they've seen this time and time again, not just with these administrative issues, but with all sorts of standing issues January 20th, pre-January 6th, and post-November 3rd, obviously. But I think there's a sentiment out there that's a frustration for people where they are just saying, so what? So I'm going to ask you, so what? What if it does go to these places? What's going to become of it?
Well, no, I think that's a good point. The corporate influence over government isn't anything new. So let's say when you're a Western democracy, let's just say you accept corporate influence over your government and its agencies. And so that's kind of part of what happens. But the second phase, of decline of Western democracy is, government influence over representative democracy, corporate influence over representative democracy, corporate influence over elections. And that's, like I mentioned, that's like kind of third world stuff. And so you imagine what we're turning towards the courts. And the courts, are probably the last place you want to go to correct your government, because the third phase of decline of a Western democracy is your courts are corrupt.
Yeah, right.
And so we want to stay out of that. So part of my goal is to make sure the courts hold the government accountable in my practice, because we want to save the courts. And so here you turn to the courts to save election administration. And I think that's important, because if private corporations are allowed to engage in urban election administration like they have, then we don't know who our representatives are. We don't know who the president is. We don't know who the governor is. And that's how it works. And so, that's how bad the left is right now.
Yeah.
Is that they're going to use private corporations to engage in election administration to win elections. But if you look like in chapter 5 of Amos, I mean, it basically says, the prophet Amos says to the Jewish people, fight for your culture, but if you lose the courts, stay quiet, pray, because there's nothing to do. So losing the courts, you see, if the courts aren't going to protect our First Amendment rights, they're not going to protect our rights to fair and impartial elections, then it's a sign that we're really going down.
That is such an astute point that you make, and I hope people catch what you just said, because the Democrats use the corporate interests, the lobbyist money essentially is what it is, to pay to get their people in. But what they tell you in the media and what they tell you at their press conferences and what they tell you in their primaries is that the Republicans, the conservatives, are the ones that are being bought by corporate interests, that those greedy corporate commercialists out there are stealing your jobs, and we care about you and we want you to have the best life possible. So here, rely on us and we'll take care of those greedy corporations. Whatever they're saying to you is exactly what they are doing themselves. They're basically hiding in plain sight, and they're doing it. They're snubbing their noses at us at this point. It's so obvious that they don't think anybody's going to see, because we've become comfortable for too long.
No, I think that's right. And some of those people criticizing corporations, engaging in consumer fraud and whatnot. I mean, some of those people are my friends, but you're right with respect to some of the anti-capitalist rhetoric and so forth. There's a split, eventually between those who are skeptical of corporate power. Some think, sort of a moderate amount of government regulation is required to keep them in line, and then there are socialists, right?
Yeah.
So I'm more in that former camp. I think that the government has to mediate against corporations because they do have a lot of power. But how do you do that when the corporations are actually running the elections?
Exactly.
So it's interesting about this $400 million from Zuckerberg, because it came in about the time that Congress was giving big tech heat on Capitol Hill. So it was about Section 230 and the immunity for the big tech. So you can see how that would work. Now, the early evidence I've seen, because the nonprofits could have taken the money and been ineffective, but the evidence I've seen is that through some preliminary analysis and talking to statisticians, is that the CTCL and the private corporations were effective at modifying voter conduct in these urban areas. And so they would have swung the election in these swing states. And so our purpose, of course, is now that they're getting that data, that they're going to do it again in 2022 in Wisconsin and Minnesota and other places where there are U.S. Senate seats open. or governor's races open. And so we're very interested in that. In Georgia, for example, the CTCL put $6 million in for the U.S. presidential race, that contest. But in the U.S. Senate race, they put another $4 million into Fulton County. So that's real money. I mean, $4 million. Wow. Okay. For $4 million, we'll keep your private corporations engaged. One of the things we're focusing on is the continuing threat of private corporations engaging in election administration in urban locales.
So in your research and the lawsuits that you filed, what's the next step for you personally?
Well, Wisconsin's sort of the deep dive. We're trying to figure out exactly how CTCL and the private corporations did it. So we filed the 3 lawsuits, as I mentioned, Green Bay, Racine, and Kenosha. We'll eventually file lawsuits in Milwaukee and Madison. But meanwhile, we're having legislative hearings. So tomorrow I'm at a legislative hearing before Janel Brandtjen's committee in the General Assembly, and I'm going to testify as to what I told you, and that this has to stop because you're undermining representative democracy. You're really causing the people to question whether they should accept the election results at all.
Suppression. And they scream about suppression all the time.
When you look at all this stuff, it's like, you read the Washington Post or the New York Times and, you're insane to criticize the government. But, that's a long ways from American ideals. I just think, I think that the reason why America has done as well as it's done is because American citizens have required the best out of America. The government should get very little credit.
Yes.
All the good things that happen is the people organizing through the representatives insisting it happens.
Yes.
And so we played out of, Senator Tim Scott talked about the original sin. Well, the people of America got rid of that sin of slavery. They passed laws regarding civil rights, and we're moving forward.
Yeah.
We can do the same in these other subject areas like election administration, and so forth.
What would be your suggestion, or how would you bring these corporations to justice, essentially? Is it through the people not shopping there? Is it holding them accountable in litigation? What's the solution to this epic spider web of corruption that we have going on right now?
Well, I think the people are doing pretty well. I mean, I actually think it's kind of amazing from where I'm coming from. I've been practicing law for 30 years, but how people are finding alternative news sources than mainstream media to find out what's actually happening.
Yeah,
it's almost like they see that they're not getting the truth from the Washington Post, the New York Times, so they search for a different alternative news. And what they need to do is ensure that who's talking, who's the source, are they speaking factually. And even in this interview, I've tried to be as factual as possible because this is what I see, and I'm sharing the witness with your viewing audience, and they should agree, and then they can witness it to others. And I think that's what we're kind of losing here is that these mainstream media outlets no longer report on what can be seen. They're creating a narrative which isn't accurate.
Are you, I don't want to use the word afraid, but are you in a position where you could be a media target?
Oh, yeah. I've been a target in the past and currently. I think the critical thing for me is that, I'm representing people. Sometimes they're unpopular people, but we have to have the courts, work their function of protecting the people from the government. So if you imagine when I go to court, I'm presenting that the most important cases the courts decide are when people are suing the government. Now, I know there are criminal lawyers and family lawyers and real estate lawyers who all think their cases are the most important. But I come back to you, Marcus, and say, no, these are the most important cases. If the court can't protect protect the people from the government, then we're lost.
That I laugh because that phrase alone is mind-boggling. Protect the people from the government. I want to put that on a T-shirt. I want to put that on a billboard. That is so far gone from where we started as a country. I'm just blown away by that phrase that you said. Protect the people from the government. That is everything that's wrong with where we are at right now in our society.
Well, I think that's right. But these are tools that the people have used before when they needed to, and that's sort of the tools of resistance, the tools of a populist or a revolutionary.
Yeah.
And so when you see the government is getting off, then the people need to react. Now, if there are enough democratic inputs, you use the democratic inputs, and I think there are enough right now, including lawsuits. But if the court shuts down and won't provide remedies to people who've been transgressed by the government, then that's a problem for all of us. And I think that when you think about the postmodern turn that the liberals have taken here,
yeah.
I mean, I did one example there. Remember when I talked about the criminal ban on absentee ballot harvesting and how clever the liberals were in creating a 501c3 called Vote at Home Institute? That's very clever rhetoric, similar to pro-choicers choosing the phrase pro-choice to oppose the pro-lifers.
Yeah.
And so when you think about how far they've gone, we have to respond by basically understanding how they think. And so that's the postmodern. So I, as a lawyer, as a citizen, I've taken the postmodern term, and I'm willing to address the left on their terms.
Yeah.
And that's why I think basically my approach splits the left. I mean, the populist left, a lot of them will say, look, Erick has a place. But this crazy sort of corporate left, you're right. They want nothing to do with me, because by me requiring the agencies and the public officials to follow the law gives the corporations less room to maneuver. Because often when the government is exceeding its authority, it's because the corporations want them to.
Yeah. I think what you just said, again, is it's such a mental shift for people, because I think we get into these grooves of routine, comfortability. Obviously, being in the Midwest, we've got our family focus. We really we love the down-home nature of what the country is, raising our families. I mean, I'm here because I'm trying to raise my family. I grew up in Minnesota my whole life. But what you just said about thinking like them, shifting, it's just a shift in mindset. The way any good salesman will tell you, the way to connect with somebody is not to tell them what you have to offer them, but to reach them on their level, to try to find out who they are and meet them there, and then see what their needs are and give them a product based off of that. And I don't think it's any different here, Erick. But what I think is happening, and tell me if I'm wrong, because you've got you got way more experience than I do in the court systems litigating these battles against the government, is that the word weaponizing is everything that they have. They have weaponized the media. They have weaponized, or they're starting to weaponize the court systems. They're weaponizing big corporations. They're weaponizing elementary schools with critical race theory. They're trying to infiltrate from within the entire system to make it a tool that they wield to control the minds of the people of the country. And I think we as conservatives, we have so much logic, we have so much common sense, but when we see the violence, when we see the frustration, the anger, the hate, I think it turns the majority of people off to where they say, if I have to shift my mind to think like that, I don't ever want to become that. But what it does is it forces conservatives into a shell, and they pull back and they pull back. And that advance from them just keeps coming and coming. And all of a sudden now you're overwhelmed and you're now basically off the grid at this point. So in your experiences, how can you shift the mindset of a conservative who just wants to be left alone, who just wants to raise their family in peace, go to church, not be told by the government what to do? How can you shift that from that mindset of conservatism into the left without becoming the left?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult. I mean, we found that converting people on the left, the type of populist philosophy that I describe is much easier. The philosophy of resisting the government doesn't come natural to conservative thought, particularly post-World War II conservatism. And so it's really the conservatives have been the problem. I always laugh when I see that 92% of the people have lost faith in the government, but the last 8% are conservatives. So they're the last ones to the party, you see. And so it's really difficult. I don't spend much time trying to convert conservatives. Now, there are a lot of people who think like I do already. Yeah. They just agree. So the populists are already there. The ones that you're talking about, I mean, the conservatism, the hardcore conservatism, like say Edmund Burke, was basically trying to conserve the old regime, trying to conserve things. And I don't think there are very many of those people left. It's kind of come down to, are you a populist, or are you going to sit on your couch? And if you're going to sit on your couch, then you're not a populist. A populist would be actively engaged in improving government. And now, when I say populism, actively engaged in improving government, I mean actively engaged in improving government in every subject area. And so, this almost is like the energy of the people saying we can have a better government than we have. Now, the progressives, because they're cheating, the ends justify the means. Yeah, they can't say that anymore. And so, so this is the playing field. It represents probably 75% of American people. So if we would just be populists and insist that the government improve in every subject area, we'd win all the elections. But we also get in trouble because, we have politicians who want to promote themselves, and we have corporations that get involved and want to influence policy. So it's not perfect. But, when you look at the left, particularly the populist left, which I admire, they're in agreement with us on a lot of these issues. It's just that they think it inevitably goes to socialism.
Right.
And they're incorrect about that. But there's still a common ground to operate between the populist left and the populist right. But with respect to these corporations now on the left, basically the big tech corporate Goliaths, the oligarchs, I mean, they're a problem, and they're threatening democracy. They're threatening election administration. So how could we not win elections in Minnesota and elsewhere? If you combine the identity politics with these big corporate oligarchs and the cancel culture and all these things, I mean, it's inevitable. And with new media like your show offering us an opportunity to communicate with each other, we're going to win. But it's going to be a great struggle because right now, based on the facts, the situation appears kind of hopeless. But, we're duty bound for me by my faith to be hopeful. And so then we move forward. But the courts are important. The courts are important that they stay just, because if they go the other way, then you can see how the corporations, the government retaliating against our people, and then the court's not defending, you're just screwed. And who would have thought when we were younger that we would get to the point where we could think we could actually be screwed? Right. So it really it comes down to the courts right now. And are the courts going to stand up to this type of oppression?
And I want to go back to what you said at the beginning of this, and that is the social media companies and big tech oligarchs. You sounded just like President Trump today, because this is what he came out with a statement today saying, and I want to read this before I get to my last question, and we'll close this out. But I just thought it was so poignant for what you just said. He said today on May 5th, what Facebook, Twitter, and Google have done is a total disgrace and an embarrassment to our country. Free speech has been taken away from the President of the United States and its citizens because the radical left lunatics are afraid of the truth. But the truth will come out anyway, bigger and stronger than ever before. The people of our country will not stand for this. These corrupt social media companies must pay political price and must never again be allowed to destroy and decimate our electoral process.
Right. Well, that's particularly hopeful. I mean, I appreciate President Trump's remarks on that. But remember, President Trump was elected president and went to Washington and was effectively unable to govern. And so we can't, I mean, sometimes we want to live the last revolution, right? So the French, they're not worried about that. Like a revolution that fails can still be sort of a moral success, right? So in Les Miserables, they have the student rebellion at the end, and it failed. But if you look at it, well, maybe it was a success. It advanced the ball with respect to communication. So I view the Trump presidency as evidence that if the people elect a president, they can't govern anymore. Yeah. And so that's problematic, you see. And so we have a difficulty now when the people elect a popular president in them governing. And so where does that lead to us as a nation? And again, I think we have to sort of resist this idea that things are normal. And I think President Trump is kind of echoing that, but it's pretty rough. So you have Trump not being able to govern because the mainstream media and other ones are colluding on this lie narrative. Yeah. And then you have an election where the private corporations have influenced the election, so we don't really know who won. And now what next? Yeah. And so Erick Lippman, he's an administrative law judge now, but I remember when he was a state legislator, he'd go around and say, the correspondence to the state capital to a particular legislative will be a specific legislative member will be 100 to 1, 100 liberal correspondent letters to one conservative one. But then he would say, but we still need the one. Right. And so with respect to election administration, the private corporations outnumber Amistad project 100 to 1. Yeah. But we still need the one, you see. Yep. And the one can make the difference. And yep. I think this idea of keeping the courts open to justice, you see, and then fighting back against the government and government oppression, undue corporate influence, we can win. All the other strategies are important, electing a president. But I'm not sure, like when you elect the people elect another populist president, whether the president should be going there to fulfill the office or rather challenging the establishment that's trying not to let him exercise the office. Yeah. There has to be some sort of conversation when, let's say, when the Republicans win the presidency, will their president be allowed to govern? If not, that's a breach of some fundamental elements of the Constitution. And we have to start that discussion because the left needs to know that we're serious. And when we win the election, we should be able to govern. And we're also serious that the elections have to be fair and impartial. Otherwise, we won't accept them. Yeah, man. We could talk for hours on spiderweb conversations from what you just said, that answer there. The wealth of knowledge that you have, I would love to have you on once again. I think this has just been so beneficial to everybody out there. I mean, it's been beneficial to me. I hope it's been beneficial to everybody out there. One quick note before we go, or one quick question. What is the next step for the people with your specific situation in Wisconsin? Are we talking about Wisconsin people doing something? Are we talking about nationwide people doing something? We're all about action on this show, and I want to take action. I want people in Wisconsin to be able to have the confidence to say, okay, this is what I can do. These are the steps. So with the specific situation that you're into in Wisconsin, what can the people of Wisconsin or the nation do? Well, I think in Wisconsin, join the Wisconsin Voters Alliance. They have a Facebook page and a web page, and they should join, and then they'll get updated on what's going on in Wisconsin. If you live in Milwaukee or in Madison, we're still looking for complainants to complain about how the election officials operated. In the other three cities, Kenosha, Racine, and Green Bay, you can join the current efforts, the current groups we have there.
What are those current groups?
Support Janel Brandtjen and the Republican Party. They're doing a great job in the state legislature. Nationwide, educate yourself on what the Amistad Project's doing, inform your neighbors, form election integrity groups. But also I want to mention people who are listening who have expertise in other subject areas. You should use your subject matter expertise to improve the government. And it's really important that we have these organizations being formed to improve the government in every subject area. Closing note, I'm reminded I was speaking at a public school, and I was speaking out a school district referendum and how the public school hadn't done it properly, and I was describing all my experiences with public school districts and their violations of the law. And there was a guy in the back who was kind of lurking around. I don't mean that a bad way, but after I was done, I was pulling together my papers, and he came over and he said, "Mr. Kaardal." Well, yes. "Well, I'm the custodian here. I've been here for 30 years, and things are much worse than you say."
Oh.
And I just want to say that there are lots of witnesses to the decline of every one of our government entities. And we need to go to those witnesses, and we need to collect information, inform others, and then take action to improve those different government entities. And part of it right now is that if you criticize, you're going to be canceled. And that's just the new thing. And so that's the opposite of what we had before. Democratic participation leads to improvement of government performance. And now the government, the public employee unions, the Democrats, they all want to cancel any criticism of the government. And so, we need the one.
Yep. I was just going to say that. You only need the one.
Right.
Erick, thank you so much for coming on. How can people get a hold of you? What's your website? How can they connect with you?
Right. mklaw.com, and they can hook into I'm blogging now, and they can hook in by Facebook or LinkedIn or my Twitter account. I'm blogging pretty regularly about what we're doing.
Can I have you back on the show again?
Absolutely. I have lots of friends I'd like to introduce you to, Marcus, as well.
I'd love to. I think it's a philosophical and a practical conversation that we have to have in this country that leads to action, that leads to what we've been talking about. Erick, thank you so much. Stick around for a second after I end this broadcast. I want to talk to you about a few things. For those of you who are leaving, thank you for tuning in. Subscribe and like if you haven't already. Check out Neil Johnson's page, CanCon, Bahizzi, Nick Moseder, Doug TeNapel. Check out all those guys because they are the news. Okay? We are the news. You are the news. It only takes one. You have a cell phone. You can go out just like Susan. I forget her last name, but she was out in New Hampshire at the hearings for the selectmen out there, and she just literally took her cell phone and was videotaping the whole thing. She was an on-site reporter, essentially, for Neil Johnson's show live, and you can go back and watch that on his page. And she ended up making the Gateway Pundit because she was an on-site reporter, just somebody who drove up from Boston with a camera phone to go record what was going on at the meeting. So you have way more power than you think. It only takes the one, and courage is the key. Erick, thank you so much, and hang out. I'll talk to you in a second.
Great, thank you.
Bye, everybody.